So we're going to talk. I'm going to go through stuff, relatively quickly, but you should probably be somewhat familiar with quite a lot of these terms, and so there'll be. I think it's useful for you to kind of have some idea about the meanings of these terms, and we'll look a little bit at the justification for the different views. So we'll be briefly going through kind of communism and socialism, welfare liberalism, then libertarianism, conservatism, fascism, oligarchy, populism, and anarchism. Right, so there's quite a lot there. But the basic, they're all views about who should be in charge and the values the government should have. Let's start off with communism, which I guess is pretty much out of favor in the US. Generally, there's not many people advocating communism, but certainly it's worth being aware of. What does communism say? So the aims of communism are to have a classless society, so no kind of hierarchy. Uh, so when it was originally being kind of formulated, what was especially important was the distinction between the working class, people who did all and there were people that was especially in the factories and in the farms, uh, and then the wealthy, who were the kind of the bosses, and then so they were the bourgeoisie. So the idea of communism is like we eliminate the distinction between different classes. Say everybody is equal. And that's the idea, not just everybody is sort of morally equal, but everybody should be equal in society. Everybody should have actual kind of equality. And so the idea was, right, rather than have bosses and kind of corporations owning stuff, the idea is that the people should own stuff. So there should be sort of collective ownership of the major resources in society, stuff like the factories, the land, and the resources in the land. So the idea is that if there's a profit to be made from using those resources or that sort of thing, then everybody should benefit. Right? It shouldn't just be like the wealthy people, rather everybody should benefit. So that means there would be, at least in the extreme forms of communism, the idea is that there would be elimination of private property, and certainly elimination of like individual ownership of businesses, and rather the ownership the people should own everything. So ideally, at least according to some forms of communism, the idea is then that if the people are owning everything and people are making all the decisions, you don't need any sort of separate government because everything is going to be just run by the people. So we may have all sorts of criticisms of communism, and I think it's good to be aware of like how there might be different forms. Suddenly, it seems like that's not a view which is going to be popular in the United States these days. But I mean, so there are these ideas of the idea. I think that one of the main defenses of communism is like it's the idea that it's the fairest approach. So the idea from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. So the idea is that in a fair society, people get what they need, and people should be devoted to helping society and giving as much as they can for their society. So the idea is you shouldn't be motivated by purely selfish motivations. You should be motivated by the aim to do what's good for society. Obviously, in in the 19th century, when communism was being formulated, it was being formulated as a reaction to capitalism. It was like the time when a lot of people were getting very rich because they owned corporations. You see that in Europe, you see it in the United States. People, you have big names who become extremely rich. So the idea of communism is that you overthrow uh, the uh, the owners and you establish government by the people. And so this idea like the people, the proletariat, should be able to determine what happens in society. So and so in some ways that is a kind of dictatorship. It's like the people are saying how society should be run. So it's a sort of like you might see it as a radical democracy, or you might see it as a dictatorship. The idea is that there's not necessarily a lot of freedom in a communist society, because the idea is that people should be able to the people should be able to decide how everybody else behaves. Obviously, in the United States and other countries, there's a lot more emphasis on individual freedom, and so that seems at odds with the aims of communism. So we talked about like how capitalism was kind of becoming very powerful, especially in the 19th century. Kind of in the industrialization of society was having huge effects on society. So one of the reasons that communism was kind of invented was people felt like there were massive problems with capitalism. And this is especially due to the philosopher Karl Marx. So Marx argued that workers are paid less than the value they create. The idea is known as surplus value. So it's like that's what generates profit for the owners, because the workers are creating more value than they create, and then the owners take that value and they get rich. So the Marxist idea is that, well, that is exploiting people. They're creating value, but they're not getting to keep that value. And they're forced to sell their labor in order to survive. I mean, obviously, defenders of capitalism would say, well, that's how capitalism works. That's what's so great about capitalism. People are kind of motivated to become owners. But the Marxist critique is like, well, that's a form of exploitation. They also say that work is inherently alienating, especially if you are working in a factory. Generally, work is sort of meaningless, it's repetitive, and so workers are not given a rich life, rather they have to do work which basically causes them to feel bad. They're alienated from their life. They don't find meaning in their own personal work because their work is just working for a boss. So it's especially the idea, if you're just working for a boss, if you don't own the means of production, then you don't feel like very invested in what you're doing. So the Marxists believed there was a kind of class struggle, and there was a kind of idea of the workers, the proletariat, will always be at war with their bosses. So that they thought, well, that was an inherent part of capitalism. It leads to this idea of like there's an inherent struggle between the bosses and the workers. The bosses are trying to maximize the profits, and the workers are trying to get better wages and working conditions. Marx had this idea that it was sort of inevitable that capitalism was going to be overthrown. He kind of saw a future when eventually every country would have a revolution, and that would mean that capitalism would end. So far, that hasn't come true, and it doesn't seem on the cards anytime soon. So that prediction seems to be kind of uh, optimistic on his part. All right. Marx argued that capitalism tended towards overproduction, leading to economic crises and recessions. The idea is that capitalists are constantly driven to expand production, but the market can't always absorb the goods. Certainly, I mean, it does seem like that capitalism, the market, does have frequent recessions. That's this boom and bust. And that's a very sort of common part of a capitalist society. Uh, Marx also thought that profit would tend to fall over time due to increasing competition, and that can lead to economic stagnation and crises. So these seem like, well, there seems maybe some truth in that. What is especially interesting, I think, in the Marxist critique is that capitalism, if it's unchecked, leads to monopolies. And that leads to individual businesses or corporations having a stranglehold over the market, which means that they can then totally determine the prices and make more profit, and that leads to more inequality. And I guess defenders of capitalism say like, well, there's always going to be competition, and there's that competition is good, uh, but there's a question about how much is there competition. And I mean, these days when we think about competition, maybe you think of search engines. I mean, like, does Google really have any significant competition? So it seems like Google has a total monopoly, and that gives them a lot of control. Marx argued that capitalism creates a kind of false consciousness among workers, leading them to think that capitalism is inevitable, that there's no other option. Uh, and Marx argued that, well, that you sort of need to break through that sort of false consciousness. I mean, certainly in the United States, I think most people think there is no alternative to capitalism. So Marx would say, well, that's a misunderstanding. There is an alternative, and people would be better off if they understood the alternatives. Marx also kind of invented the idea of commodity fetishism, which is the idea that people think there's something inherently good in stuff, in things, and so they kind of like think things are really what's important in life. And it seems like, well, that's definitely how a lot of people think. Like owning bling and stuff like that is like, well, that's what they think is important. And so Marx is like saying, well, actually, that's a misunderstanding, and that's just sort of just feeding capitalism, just feeding the market. So that leads to more alienation and more exploitation. All right. So that's kind of communism and the Marxist critique of capitalism. And I think, I mean, generally what we think these days is, well, communism is just not a viable approach. And countries which have come close to practicing communism have had massive social problems. Therefore, we should move away. Communism is not a viable option. I mean, there are a few communists around who would still defend communism, but they're definitely in a very small minority. I think what's much more kind of practiced around the way in different countries is what's known as democratic socialism. Uh, so democratic socialism kind of takes some ideas from communism, but kind of mixes them with much more democracy. And democratic socialism believes in some moderate form of capitalism, but they say that capitalism needs to be highly regulated. So democratic socialism believes in democracy. They definitely believe that you have to have a lot of democracy. They believe in lots of elections, freedom of speech, and protection of human rights. So they definitely reject any kind of all the authoritarian or totalitarian parts of socialism and communism. they agree with the idea of communism that basically it's better if people own their companies, and they don't necessarily believe that the state should own stuff. Rather, they believe especially stuff like worker cooperatives. And you know, there are some examples of worker cooperatives, even in the United States. Um, Public supermarket is owned by the workers in Publix. Uh, Cabot Creameries, the cheese people, is owned by, I think, a collective of 800 farms. So, I mean, there are examples of worker cooperatives within the United States. And we have other forms of collective ownership. So the idea is like if you have social ownership, if the workers actually are going to directly benefit from their work, then that's going to promote them to work hard and believe in what they do and get more rewards from what they're doing. Democratic socialists believe in social justice. They definitely they believe that we should work against poverty, against inequality, and against discrimination. So they totally support things like universal health care, affordable housing, and a strong social safety net. So if you're out of work, you should be able to get some support from some kind of government scheme which will help you stay alive until you get your next job. And they definitely believe that capitalism can't just kind of go unchecked. There has to be a lot of regulation of the markets to ensure kind of fairness and protect consumers. And so you have things like what we might think of as like stopping monopolies from having too much control. They would believe in things like health and safety at work, saying the government should totally be checked about safety conditions. All right, so what's behind all that? Well, there's the idea of like inequality is basically bad, and they think inequality should be reduced. So the things like progressive taxation. So if you're poor, you shouldn't pay much tax. If you're rich, you should pay a lot of tax. They believe in like social programs, like things like healthcare. They believe in like child care and policies which help make sure that everybody in society has an economic opportunity. So they certainly believe in things like workers' rights. They believe in trade unions and the idea that people should be able to organize and improve their workplaces. They definitely believe in stuff like that, kind of social safety net, and things like healthcare, education, and housing, and they totally believe in democracy. So, you know, I think democratic socialism is certainly kind of an idea which is pretty familiar in a lot of European countries. I think we especially think of the Scandinavian countries, Norway, Denmark, Finland, as countries kind of practicing some form of democratic socialism. And certainly people advocate for democratic socialism in the United States. And I guess some members of the Democrat Party kind of advocate for it. It's kind of a very closely related idea, maybe basically almost the same, but maybe just the same, slightly different name. It's kind of welfare liberalism, but liberalism has more of an emphasis on personal liberties. So maybe the central idea of liberalism is like personal liberties are what's important. So welfare liberalism says, yeah, personal liberties are important, but we need to aim for social welfare too. So you need to have an emphasis on individual rights, things like freedom of speech and freedom of thought, freedom of association. Those are kind of like the most important things. But there also needs to be kind of social justice. So the difference between welfare liberalism and democratic socialism is more just like slightly one of emphasis. There's more emphasis on personal liberties in welfare liberalism. But there's still a strong belief in ideas of social justice and ideas of a welfare state. The idea that if you are on hard times, if you're ill, if you're disabled, if you are discriminated against, then the state will kind of help you out. So there's a strong belief in stuff like unemployment insurance, universal health care, universal education, and social security. So I guess one thing that's sort of notable in a lot of countries, in some European countries, uh, especially the Scandinavian countries, also I think Germany, is that not only is K through 12 education free, but university education is also free. So you can get a free university education. Uh, and I think some people have argued that would be a good thing in the United States. Obviously, uh, in most states, I think all states actually, there are state universities. In New York, we're familiar with both the SUNY system and the CUNY system, and they tend to have lower fees than private universities, but they're definitely not free. Uh, Certainly, welfare liberalism, like democratic socialism, believes in market regulation and says that you have to kind of regulate capitalism to kind of make sure there's not unfairness, there is consumer protection, the workers get protected, and that you don't get too much monopolies, you don't get corporations having too much power. Uh, Obviously, we think in the United States, there are huge corporations and they have a huge amount of power. And so there's big questions about, are we comfortable with the huge corporations having all that power? And certainly democratic socialism, welfare liberalism would say, no, that there's big problems with that and they should be regulated. So the ideas of there's sort of similar ideas to democratic socialism, ideas of reducing inequality, providing a social safety net, a strong belief in equal opportunity. The idea is like whoever you are, whatever kind of family you're born into, everybody should have an equal opportunity to succeed in society. So definitely then everybody should have access to education, healthcare, and any other essential services. I mean, but one feature of the United States, which is somewhat different from any other industrialized country, is in the United States, there isn't like a universal healthcare, and generally healthcare can be very expensive. Whereas in just about every other industrialized country, there is at least some basic form of universal healthcare. I mean, it's complicated, and universal healthcare in other countries is sort of under pressure, but certainly that's a big difference between the United States and other countries. So both democratic socialism and welfare liberalism, they're kind of balancing individual liberty and social welfare, and kind of liberalism kind of puts a high priority on individual liberty, but kind of still is kind of thinking about general welfare. So moving more towards the idea of individual freedom is the theory of libertarianism. So libertarianism puts much more emphasis on the idea of individual liberty. It says that's what's really important. And they don't believe that government should be doing very much. Rather, that government should have a very small role. And what government should mainly be doing is protecting individual rights. So libertarians don't think that government should be trying to solve social problems. Libertarians tend to have a strong belief in the free market, and they think libertarians tend to think that capitalism is great, and capitalism is the best way to solve social problems. So one of the big differences between kind of libertarianism and, say, democratic socialism is the idea that is like, how much confidence do you have that capitalism, if you just leave leave the market, if you leave businesses to operate unchecked, how much are they going to improve society, or how much are they going to exploit people? Democratic socialism tends to think that there's a strong potential for exploitation, whereas libertarianism thinks, oh, capitalism is basically great and is not going to exploit people, ultimately. And there may be a few kind of small cases where it does that, but ultimately, capitalism is going to correct those sorts of things. So libertarianism loves the free market, and thinks that the free market should be really encouraged, and definitely, they don't want lots of regulations. They don't want kind of monopolies to be stopped very much. They don't want the lots of taxes on corporations. They don't want lots of health and safety regulations. They think that the market will solve all those problems. And so libertarians have a strong emphasis on personal responsibility. And so, they think that if you fall ill or you lose your job, it shouldn't be the job of the government to help you out. Rather, there should be you should prepare for those things ahead of time, or you should get charity from other people. They don't think that the government should have the job of solving people's individual problems. And they think that it sort of backfires if you have government helping people, because then they think that sort of makes individuals dependent on the state and takes away their willingness to really solve their own problems. People become more passive if the government devotes lots of resources to helping people out. Right, so that's libertarianism. Then there's conservatism, which places a big emphasis on tradition. This idea that we should keep on with tradition and traditional values, so they are very skeptical about saying we should make big changes to society. There's plenty of debates today about whether we should do things in traditional ways or whether we should move to what some people would call progressive values. Conservatives are very skeptical about progressive values. Conservatives often emphasize things like family and religion, and they say those are the things we should believe in, and traditional family, traditional religion, we shouldn't be kind of trying to change that. Conservatives are okay with social hierarchies. They're totally okay with there being divisions between rich and poor, and they emphasize things like family, religion, and also the nation. One thing is a huge issue in the US today is what about valuing the nation? To what extent should we say the nation is an important value in itself? So conservatives tend to say, yeah, definitely be in favor of the nation. They want order and stability, and so they believe in pretty clear rules. They don't, they're not in favor of lots of changing of rules or kind of lots of say, oh, let's change society. They want things to kind of stay pretty much the same as they were. And generally, they tend to favor limited government. So you can see sort of some possible tensions between conservatism and libertarianism. Libertarianism is all in favor of capitalism and capitalism being run unfettered. sometimes if you let capitalism run unfettered, that can cause massive social change. Conservatives don't like massive social change. They like things to stay the same. So there might be sometimes when conservatives are a little worried about how the market is changing society, and they think like, well, we need to keep an eye on old values like family, church, and nation. So there's some tension between those two views. We tend to think of like the Republican Party as both being conservative and kind of favoring libertarianism, but there can be tensions between those, and you see those in the Republican Party. Now, I guess another system which we sort of familiar with, and the term fascism is being used quite a lot these days. So what does fascism mean? Fascism especially focuses on nationalism. They say nation is like maybe the number one priority. It says that fascists hold that their country is the best country. And they often advocate for imperialism, taking over other countries. And I guess so. Certainly in the 20th century, you saw Germany, when it was a fascist state, taking over other countries, and were trying to be very expansionist. There was imperialism in the 19th century. Great Britain, France, Germany, and Portugal were all very expansionist and imperialistic. We don't always think of it, so certainly they were kind of nationalist. We don't necessarily think of them as fascist. So being nationalist doesn't necessarily mean kind of being fascist, but certainly fascists tend to be nationalist. Certainly, fascism also tends to be very authoritarian. There's a kind of centralized government, very dictatorial, and is often associated with militarism. Obviously, if you're believing in expansionism and taking over other countries, then you definitely believe in the army and you glorify the army. Certainly, if you go to countries which have a fascist past, you can find all sorts of celebrations of military strength and military power. I mean, that's true in a lot of countries. I mean, it's not just fascism. All sorts of countries celebrate the military, but maybe it's especially a strong tendency in fascist countries. There tends to be a cult of personality. There's a long history of fascist countries having very charismatic leaders and a lot of focus on the personality of one particular leader. That's a big kind of part of fascism. There has to be a suppression of opposition, so not democratic. There's a focus on doing away with opposition. And strong control of the economy. So not a free market, but rather so not letting the market just do what it wants, rather focusing the businesses and the economy on promoting national goals, and also they tend to suppress labor unions. So that's fascism. And it's worth having some idea what that is. Another word we've been hearing quite a lot recently is oligarchy, and the different forms of oligarchy. We'll look at those different forms. But the basic idea of oligarchy is it's ruled by the few. Rather than being democracy, you have a small group at the top who are basically controlling society. And so I guess old societies like kingdoms were oligarchies. If a king is in control, that's an oligarchy. Then there's other kind of forms. You can have military rule. That would be an oligarchy. oligarchy tends to have obviously, if you have a few people in control, there's a very unequal distribution of power. You certainly don't believe in the democracy or the people running things. You have the ruling group which controls everything. And oligarchies tend to be run for the benefits of those in power. Obviously, when it was kings, kings tended to run things so they benefited. There tends to be a lack of accountability in oligarchy. Those in control aren't really subject to the rule of law. They aren't prosecutable. There's a lot of corruption. They abuse their power and they get away with it. That's a very kind of typical feature of oligarchy. And obviously, since there isn't much democracy, there isn't a whole lot of political participation. There's a lot of suppression of dissent. People are not allowed to protest, and the oligarchy kind of keeps tight wraps on any form of protest and eliminates protesters a lot of the time. So we mentioned the idea of kingdoms. So when you have a kingdom, a king or a queen in charge, that's aristocracy, and there's a whole kind of nobility, and the idea is the nobility are in charge. I mentioned a military junta where you have rule by military leaders. We see in other cases of oligarchy where you have religious rule. I guess we think of maybe especially countries in Islamic nations. It seems to be run by kind of a strong rule by the religious leaders. And back in medieval Europe, there was maybe some form of theocracy or pushes towards theocracy. So those are all three forms of oligarchy. What we maybe in the United States, what we're especially kind of thinking about today, people who are worried about oligarchy, is the idea that it's the billionaires who are in control. We know who the big billionaires are, and the idea is like, well, actually, they're the people running society. So it doesn't really matter who you vote for. The billionaires are the one in control. So if you think that's plutocracy, when society is being run by the wealthy. And yeah, so there've been many accusations that that's what we have in the United States. Obviously, the billionaires themselves deny that's what's going on. So there's big questions. Yeah. Mhm. It is theocracy. If it's being run by a religion, if everything is being run by religious rule, then that's theocracy. Yes. So like you have in Islamic nations, you have the idea that everything's being run by Islamic law and is being run by the religious leaders. So that would be theocracy. I guess back in the day when like the Pope was running everything in some countries, then that was also a form of theocracy. Obviously, I guess one thing about those forms of oligarchy is that they tend to be somewhat unstable. Well, I mean, I guess aristocracy was successful for many millennia in some places, but eventually they got overthrown. And often theocracies get overthrown, so they may not be very stable forms of government. Another idea we see quite a lot these days is the idea of political populism, which is the idea that there's the people and then there's the elite. And the idea is, so populism is being on side of the people and being against the elite. I think you hear a lot of that idea in the United States, people being against the elite. And but so you can have populism, both kind of right-leaning populism and left-leaning populism. So if you're a left-leaning populist, then you would be against, say, the billionaires. You would say like they're the elite trying to run society. On the right, you're against university professors kind of apparently being in charge of everything. As a university professor myself, I haven't actually noticed that I'm in charge of everything, but I guess you have this idea there's the liberal elite, and the idea in the United States, you hear like, oh, there's Hollywood and the universities, and they create all these values, and the people should rise up against them. So populism is definitely sort of anti-establishment. So it's kind of not conservative. It's like saying there should be a sort of revolution. And the people should overthrow the elite. Uh, so populism believes in something like direct democracy. They believe that the people should be in charge of stuff, and you get populist referendums and initiative trying to kind of push society in a particular direction. One feature you often get in populism is charismatic leadership. You have leaders who attract a lot of attention and get a lot of supporters. So there's often a connection between fascism and populism, because of that sort of charismatic leadership. Uh, that's often how you get fascist leaders in control because they get put there by a populist movement. So you have, like I mentioned, there's left-wing populism and right-wing populism. On the left, they'll focus on things like economic inequality, and they'll advocate for things like higher taxes on the wealthy, stronger trade unions, and expanded social programs. Whereas on the right, they focus on things like immigration, nationalism, and traditional values. So you can see like there's all sorts of different forms of populism. But yeah, the basic idea is you want to empower the people and challenge the status quo. So definitely populism is an idea you see quite a lot these days. Yeah. Mhm. All right. So talking about different views of oligarchy. So we're going back to oligarchy. Oligarchy is ruled by the few. So you have like a small number of people involved. So like if you have an aristocracy, then the king's in charge. The king and the various kind of the royal family and the nobility, they're the ones in charge. So it's a small portion of the population. I mean, they're basically the same thing. I mean, it gets a little complicated. Like you have countries now, like the UK and I think maybe Sweden. The UK currently has King Charles, so it's kind of a monarchy, but King Charles has no political power, right? So it's basically a sort of like decorative monarchy. Doesn't really mean anything. Back in like the Middle Ages, the king had all the power. There was like there was the government. There was no democracy. There was like the people had no power. It was basically the king telling everybody what to do. Now the king wasn't necessarily religious, or it was going to be different. So if you have an oligarchy, it depends on who's in power. So if the king may not be particularly religious or is not doing things for religious reasons, rather the king is doing things for um, his own purposes. Whereas in theocracy, you have the religious reason, you have a religion in charge, and it's going to be the religious leaders in charge. So that's a very different sort of thing from the king being in charge. So that theocracies, we have the religious leaders in charge. Plutocracy is where you have wealthy in charge. So I mean, often like that's going to be linked back in the time when there were kings. The kings tended to be rich, so it tended to be that the nobility had all the money, and they were designated as being aristocrats. Uh, there was this idea back in the Middle Ages that the kings were inherently superior to everyone else. So the idea was the nobility, it wasn't just they had these fancy names, but they were actually better than everyone else. So in aristocracy, there was this idea that nobility made you better. Uh, Now in plutocracy, we have like the wealthy in charge. Uh, I'm not sure that's not necessarily linked to the idea that those people are better than everybody else. Although sometimes it does seem like they think they're better than everyone else. But I mean, it varies. Uh, I mean, obviously, in the United States today, we do not have theocracy. The religious leaders are not particularly in charge. We don't have a king or a queen. So this doesn't seem like we don't have that. Some people have claimed that in the United States, really the people who have all the power are the billionaires. If that were true, then that would make the United States a plutocracy. Now, it's a question: do the billionaires have all the power? Well, I mean, maybe it's complicated, but I mean, certainly they have quite a lot of power. Uh, so it seems like the worry that the United States has a plutocracy is certainly a one which should be taken more seriously than worries about theocracy or aristocracy. Oh, it's complicated. And then there's, I mean, I guess suddenly some countries have had the military take over, and then that would be things being run by the military. Obviously, the military have all the power in terms of having the biggest weapons. So there's always you have to be careful about like how to what extent the military is kind of thinking that they might want to seize power. Hasn't happened in the United States anytime I can recall. Um, Although I think occasionally there are ideas of that too. So other countries have definitely had the military take over. Does that clear things up? Good. All right. All right. So we talked about populism. Now it's worth mentioning kind of one last view in this list, which is anarchism, which is the rejection of all government, and says basically we would be better off without any government at all. And the idea is that people should just, rather than have a government, and then obviously, well, what does a government have? You have government, you have the courts, you have the cops, and you have the military. So some people would say we should do away with the courts, we should do away with the cops, do away with the military, and just the people should run their own lives. Yeah, and so I mean, obviously, your first thought maybe, well, that's going to be chaotic. That's going to be just as Hobbes would have said, in that state, life would be nasty, brutish, and short because there'd be nothing to protect us. But anarchists say they have a real faith in humans, and they think that people will be better off if they run their own lives rather than have a government. So the ideas of anarchists that you reject authority, you have a lot of individual liberty, and basically people should be able to do what they want, and they shouldn't be told by the state what to do. So there aren't many anarchists in the United States, so there's a few, especially among some university professors. But it is a so it's not really. I guess one thing about anarchism is like it's hard to get a political party uh, trying to be elected saying, well, we're going to introduce anarchism because like and once you have a political system, then you already have a government system. So you'd have to have a sort of popular revolution in order to do away with the government. There's different forms of anarchism. So we mentioned right at the start, communism, at least in some forms, argues for doing away with the state. So that's a form, can be a form of anarchism. Uh, some people believe in like total capitalism. So they say we should do away with the government and just have completely uncontrolled capitalism. So you have private property and free markets and no courts, no government employing cops, not even any government employing military. The idea is that capitalism, the kind of big companies, would take care of all that. You could have like the Google army, or the kind of they're the ones who would defend the borders. Uh, and then there's the idea of individual anarchism, where you just have basically individuals doing whatever they want. That seems like the most sort of hippie-like view. Uh, sometimes people have advocated like going upstate, living off the land, having no sort of control, opting out. That would be a kind of individual anarchism. So, like I say, anarchism hasn't really received a lot of attention, but it is an interesting idea. We could just do away with all government. And in some ways, it seems like an extreme idea. Right. So, what are the kind of sort of central moral debates there? Uh, we can look at these sorts of questions, like how important is the equality of citizens? And what forms of equality should be promoted? What does it take to achieve equality? So equality is a kind of huge issue, and to what extent should equality be promoted? We've seen that like communism and socialism and welfare liberalism all highly promote equality, whereas libertarianism and conservatism and fascism don't promote equality. They take that to be a fundamental value. Then there's the question about how good is capitalism? Is capitalism something we should be really have a lot of faith in, or is capitalism a problem? So if you think like the business world inherently leads to inequality and leads to the exploitation of workers, then you're going to want to limit capitalism. If you think that capitalism just is just the best way to run things and it doesn't really lead to big moral problems and big inequality, then you're going to just want capitalism to go ahead full steam. Then there's a question about like, how much faith do you have in government? Is government good at solving social problems? Should we be expecting the government to be able to solve issues of inequality and unfairness? Or should we think that there are better ways to solve problems? So, you saw some of these various views had to put a lot of faith in government. Obviously, it tends to be that communism, well, some forms of communism and some forms of socialism put a lot of faith in government, whereas views like libertarianism and a lot of conservatism say government should be minimized because government tends to be a big problem. And then there's a big question about individual freedom. Obviously, in the United States, we hear a lot of talk about freedom and the idea that freedom is very important. Um, you see some of the views, like especially fascism and communism, and maybe kind of some forms of socialism, put less emphasis on freedom. And certainly in terms of socialism, they would say like equality is much more important than individual freedom. So those are sort of orienting issues for us to be kind of thinking about. I think it's worth thinking, since we hear so much about nationalism these days, it's worth thinking about what do we mean by nationalism. And there are various aspects to nationalism which are worth highlighting. Uh, so there's, I think, sort of related ideas of national identity, the idea of having a shared identity based on a common culture. So again, and that's a sort of big question in the United States. You know, does the United States have a common culture? Should we expect everybody to speak English? Should we kind of have more variation? Do we all have the same history? What about ethnicity? And what about territory? So certainly all these ideas play a big role in the idea of national identity. Obviously, national identity is also connected with emotions. There's the idea of pride and loyalty. Loyalty is a huge issue. You know, if you I am a naturalized US citizen, so I had to swear loyalty to the United States in order to become a US citizen. And I think a lot in the schools, there's saying the pledge. You pledge your loyalty. Yeah, yeah. I'll make them. Sure. Yeah. The slides will be available. Yeah. Um, So so identity and emotion are very kind of closely linked. And obviously, and if you believe in your nation, then you believe in like promoting your nation. So partly that's like protecting your nation and keeping it independent, keeping it united. In extreme forms, you want to kind of extend the boundaries of your nation. So those are big parts of nationalism. So there's ideas of nationalism like a sense of belonging, of seeing the nation as an extended family or community. Uh, and this idea of shared values and traditions and cultural heritage. I mean, obviously, that's I think in the United States, it's a huge issue. To what extent do we have shared values and traditions and heritage? And it's linked with history. Certainly, kind of the land is a big issue. And often nationalists want to have national independence. I guess if you think about the history of colonialism, especially the European countries into other places, so you had a lot of European colonialism into Africa, some into South America, and into India. The British were in India. A lot of the nationalist movements in those countries overthrew the rule by the European settlers, and they had nationalist movements saying that they should be in charge of their countries, not the European countries which had moved in. So I think if you look at those histories, you know, we see nationalism as being very kind of progressive in terms of overthrowing imperialism. You know, there's all sorts of varieties of nationalism. There's kind of a lot there. I don't think I want to go into all those details, but I think it's worth at least kind of mentioning them. So as I was just talking about in terms of various kind of anti-colonial countries, there's anti-colonial nationalism. So especially in India, there was a lot of Indian nationalism saying we're Indian, we should have control over our country, therefore we should have the British out. They should not be ruling our country. That was true in a lot of European countries which had control of other countries. There were nationalist movements which pushed those out. So nationalism had a big influence there. There's expansionist nationalism. I talked about colonialism. Colonialism also kind of goes to expanding your country and taking control over other countries. Apparently, the United States now wants to take over Canada and make Canada the 51st state. Oh, that would be a form of expansionist nationalism. There is romantic nationalism, which is the idea of all this idea of shared ethnicity and ancestry. And kind of civic nationalism is the idea of kind of shared citizenship and political values. So there's all sorts of different forms of nationalism, and it's worth really being aware of those different forms. Obviously, so in some ways, nationalism has a history which has helped kind of people gain control over their countries. But when it is expansionist or it's related to fascism, there have been kind of particular worries about it. It seems like nationalism can lead to exclusion and discrimination against minorities because they're deemed to be outsiders. It can lead to hatred towards foreigners because they say, well, you're not part of our country, you need to get out. That can lead to violent conflict. And it seems like nationalism can lead to authoritarianism, where kind of democracy gets diminished and leads to the suppression of individual rights. So those are some of the kind of concerns about nationalism. All right. So I want to finish off talking about the more general idea of equality of opportunity. Which seems to be a very kind of important political idea. So, I mean, I guess there's two sorts of political ideas which we see to be crucial. There's individual freedom, and I think, in some ways, probably the idea of individual freedom is just obvious to you, right? We all understand the attractions of individual freedom. I think the idea of equality of opportunity is a little bit kind of needs more thinking about. On the other hand, I think most people are in favor of the idea that there should be a level playing field, that there shouldn't be discrimination, so some people are more discriminated against, some people have less opportunity than others. Most people think, no, there needs to be equal opportunity. Not, like I said, not everybody thinks that, but and there's disagreements about how big a priority that should be. But there are kind of the idea of equal opportunity seems to be something which people have a lot of agreement about. In the US tradition, there are two names which are especially well known for defending equal opportunity. One was John Rawls. He died in 2002. And his most famous work was A Theory of Justice. It was published in 1971. And he argued for equality opportunity as justice as fairness. There's a lot of discussion in philosophy about John Rawls. Almost as well known, but not quite as well known, as Ronald Dworkin. He died in 2013. He was both a legal philosopher and a constitutional scholar, as well as a political theorist. He wrote a lot about the law, and he wrote a lot about equality of resources. And so he's known for some of he has a bunch of big books as well. So those are two people I just want to kind of mention and say a little bit about their ideas. So let's talk about Rawls first. So rules definitely believe that there should be a level playing field, which is obviously an analogy. It's a sports analogy. If you're playing football or soccer and the field is like slanted, then it's going to be harder for one team than another. It would be unfair. So we sort of think, well, to be fair, a field has to be on the level. And we take that analogy in society, we think that everybody should have equal opportunity. So the idea is that family, your wealth, your social class, your race, or your gender shouldn't put you at a disadvantage. Uh, so that part of that idea, I mean, there's a kind of question about, well, what should you put you at a disadvantage? What should put people at an advantage? And certainly rules said, well, talent and effort should be rewarded. So if you have a natural talent and if you put a lot of work into it, then you should be able to get more out of it. So it's perfectly fine if you're talented and if you work hard, you should be able to become richer than somebody else. If somebody isn't talented and if they don't work hard, then it's totally fair that they don't get as much money. So he thinks that's completely compatible with equality of opportunity. So there's the idea that everybody should have the same access to basic opportunities. And so the things you'd be thinking about are education, healthcare, and job training. So you want to kind of eliminate barriers, which makes things difficult for some groups. So that you should eliminate social barriers, economic barriers. You focus on doing away with discrimination, prejudice, and unequal access to resources. So, so why does equality of opportunity, why is that important? He says, well, it's like it's justice. It's simply the idea of fairness. Fairness requires those things. That if you want to have a fair society, there should be equality of opportunity. But Rawls also argued that there are other benefits apart from just fairness. He thinks that if you have equality of opportunity, then society is going to be more stable. Whereas if you have an unequal society, there's going to be less stability. And he also thinks it leads to a more efficient society where if everybody benefits from their increased productivity and innovation, then society is going to be better off. Whereas if some people aren't going to benefit much from working hard or being innovative, then you're going to lose out on that stuff. I think the liberal philosopher John Stuart Mill also argued that, especially in regards to discrimination against women. He argued that society was he was back in the 19th century, and he argued that his society, which was strongly discriminatory, was losing out on a lot of opportunities because women weren't contributing. If women contributed, society would be better off. So and Rawls has a sort of similar idea that if you systematically discriminate against a group of people, then society is going to be worse off because you're not going to be benefiting from the talents of those people. All right. So Rawls strongly believed in equality of opportunity. He certainly didn't believe that everybody should be equally rich. He thought that it's perfectly fine for some people to be rich and for others to not have as much money. But he thought so long as there's equality of opportunity, it's fine for there to be those sorts of wealth inequalities. So the focus is not on every opportunity, it's the focus on basic opportunity. That's what government should make sure is equal. So that's Rawls. And then there's Ronald Dworkin, who has a kind of a slightly more sort of convoluted position, maybe. He has a view about he has an argument about a thought experiment involving an auction where individuals bid for resources, and they have initial equal resources. And he's interested in, well, what's a sort of fair process? And he talks about insurance. So it's a fairly kind of complicated argument. But he makes a strong distinction between what he calls brute luck and option luck. So he says that there's inequalities arising from brute luck, which should be compensated. So like if you are born into in a region, say a family which has less health and less connections, then society should compensate so you have equality. Whereas if you take a risk, say in business, and you do really well in your business, then that's fine. So like sometimes like there's luck in terms of doing well, and he thinks, well, that's fine. But if there's like a basic, if you're basically unlucky in life, then due to things beyond your control, then you should be compensated. And he thinks society should create create a society which doesn't let brute luck have too much influence on how people's lives go. So you try to avoid the kind of thing, the discrimination due to things which are beyond people's control. In some ways, Rawls and Dworkin are arguing for kind of pretty similar ideas. Both of them agree on the idea of fairness, and they reject arbitrary inequalities. So like whether if you're born into a family with very few opportunities, or you're born into a wealthy family, they say, well, society should try and level the playing field. The differences between Dworkin and Rawls, Rawls focuses more on the idea of equal opportunity. Rawls focuses more on equality of resources. Dworkin has a more focus on the idea of individual luck. That's not something that Dworkin says a lot about. And Dworkin focuses more on the idea of individual responsibility compared to Rawls. So both these guys are basically liberals. They both think equality of opportunity is very important, but there's sort of subtle differences between them. So you can see how the argument might go. Now, we mentioned libertarians before, and just want to say just a little bit about libertarians. So, libertarians want small government, and they believe in like some kind of formal equality of opportunity, but they reject this idea of leveling the playing field. They don't think government should be doing that, and they think I guess they have two sorts of arguments against it. One is that they don't think that's the government's job, and also they don't think that government is very good at doing that. So they think that it backfires when government tries to level the playing field. So it's just not, they don't think it's a good idea for government to be doing that. So libertarians say, like, it's not really equality of opportunity, which is really important. What's important is personal responsibility, people taking responsibility for their own lives and making their own lives as good as possible. So libertarians don't have much interest in stuff like universal health care or public housing or social security. As they say, well, sort your own life out. You shouldn't be relying on government to be doing that stuff. I do want to mention there are kind of like a group of people called left libertarians who are kind of take the libertarians' idea of self-ownership and they totally believe in individual autonomy, uh, but they also believe in egalitarian. So they believe in equality. So left libertarians take the idea of a lot of personal liberty, but they also combine it with the idea that there should be a lot of equality. So you can be a kind of a libertarian, even if, but then you can bring in the idea of equality with that. Uh, all right. So I think that is where we're going to I'll stop and um, we will uh, mm, we will. Yeah, so